In this video we're going to look at the QueueHandler and QueueListener objects in the Python logging package. And these objects allow you to offload your log processing to a separate thread, and that's a practice that can be beneficial for performance in certain circumstances. Now, an example of this is when you have a critical error in your application, you want to log that and perhaps send an email to administrators. Admins can then get that email and they can respond to the issue very quickly. But the problem with this is that the operation of sending emails can be very slow. In a web service such as a Django or FastAPI application, you will often want to offload this into a separate thread, and that will avoid your response times becoming impacted by this latency. And any operation where you're sending logs over the network, it can be beneficial to offload that work using Python's QueueHandler and QueueListener. And that's what we're going to demonstrate in this video, so let's get started. Now let's start with an overview of the handlers that we're going to use in this demo. I have the Python documentation open, and this is the logging.handlers module. And this module defines some useful handlers that you're going to use typically in a Python application. Now you have the common ones such as the stream handler and the file handler. These are actually defined in the top level logging module, but they're available here in this documentation as well. Now we're going to look at a few different ones here. The first one I'm going to look at is the SMTPHandler, and this is a class that supports sending your logs to an email address via the SMTP protocol. So let's imagine a critical error occurs in your application. You might want to set up an SMTP handler in order to inform senior developers or administrators or DevOps professionals about this error, and that allows them to get the email, they see the problem very quickly, and they're able to then go in and resolve that problem. Now, of course, something to note about the SMTP handler, you don't want an email to be sent for every single log entry that's generated by your application. That would result in a huge volume of emails, and that would be extremely annoying for your administrators and for developers. You want to limit this to only critical instances when something goes wrong in the app and someone has to respond very quickly. Now we're going to see how to set up a Python handler in order to forward critical errors to the SMTP handler and thereby send those emails. Now, as well as the SMTP handler, later in the video we're going to see a couple of extra features of this logging.handlers module. We're going to look at the QueueHandler, and we're also going to look at the QueueListener. I'm going to leave the explanation of these until a little bit later in the video. And what we're going to do to get started is we're going to create an SMTP handler. So let's go back to that page. And what we're going to do in our application is we're going to send some dummy emails to a service, and it's this one here, which we'll leave a link to below the video. This service provides a free SMTP server for testing, and you can send emails to this particular host, and it's going to make those emails available in this service, and we can inspect the logs that are being generated and sent to these emails through this service. So let's get started. I'm going to go to VS Code, and I have a Python file open here. At the top of this file we can bring some imports in. We're going to import Python's logging module, and we're also going to import the SMTP handler, and I'm going to import the time module as well from Python's standard library. Now we need to define an SMTP host in order to send our emails to a particular service. Now what we're going to do is copy the email, or rather the host that we had here. So let's copy this and bring it in here, and that's going to be the server we're going to send these emails to, and by doing that we're going to see an example of the latency introduced by sending an email over a network. And that kind of latency is what can affect performance if you have a web service, for example, and that's why later in the video we're going to offload that work using the QueueHandler. Now what we need to do now is create a logger object. We're going to use the logging.getLogger function, and we can pass a name into that. So I'm going to use the _name property in Python. That's going to refer to the name of this file. Once we've done that, we can then set the level on this logger. So we're going to use the logger.setLevel function, and we can pass a level into this function, and only outputs of a severity equal to that level or more severe than that level are going to be sent to our handlers. So what I'm going to do is set this to logging.critical, and this is the most severe log level that's defined in the Python logging module, and that means that for this particular logger that we've just created, only critical log entries are going to be sent to the handler that we're going to define, which is going to be the SMTP handler. Now, as well as the logger, I'm going to quickly add a formatter here, and we're going to output the time of the log entry, as well as the level and the message when we create these logs. Now let's create our SMTP handler now. So I'm going to create a variable called SMTPHandler, and we're going to instantiate that object that we imported from the logging package. Now the SMTP handler, it requires that host that we're going to send the emails to, and we're going to set that equal to the service online here. We also need the source email address, and we're going to set that to noreply@company.com, so that goes in the keyword argument from address. And we also need to determine who are we actually sending this email to. We can do that with the two addresses, and that can be set to a string if it's just a single email, or if you want to send the email to multiple people, you can set that to a list of all of the users you want to send the email to. So for example, if you have a list of admin users, you could pass that list into this argument and it's going to send the email to all of those users. And I'm also going to pass in another argument, and that's the subject of the email. So let's say we have the subject of a critical error in the application. That's going to be the subject for the recipient of the email. They're going to see that. And finally, I'm going to pass secure equals none. And that's because we don't need to use a secure protocol here. We don't need to use TLS. We're just going to send this message directly to the handler, or rather to the host defined in this handler. So that is our SMTP handler. What we can do now is set the formatter on that handler, and we can do that with the formatter property. We're going to set that equal to the formatter that we created on line 10 here. And then finally, we can take our logger and we can call the add handler function, and we can pass this SMTP handler into this function. And that means when we create log entries, for example, by using methods such as logger.info, it's going to send the logs to the handler, and that's going to then process those logs. Now, because we set the level to critical, that means that we can only log out critical errors here. So for example, Python's logging module, the loggers have a critical log level. So we can create logs for critical events, and I'm just going to create one here called a test. And then what we're going to do is we're going to run this application. So at the bottom on the terminal, I'm going to run Python, and then it's going to be app.py. So let's run that just now, and you can see that that's running at the bottom, and that's been completed now. Now I imported the time module at the top here, so I'm going to use the time module, and we're going to time the execution of this log event. So we can create a start time here by calling the time.time function, and then just below the logger.critical output, we can print the duration of the script using this statement here. So it's an f string. We're getting the time when this f string is created, and we're subtracting the start time. That will give us a delta for the time it's taken to execute this script. So let's run python app.py again, and we're going to see the time here, and it's 1.9 seconds. So 1.9 seconds just to run this very simple script, and all of that time is coming from this logger.critical call, and that's because that is going to use our SMTP handler, and it's going to try and send an email to this SMTP host at the top over the network, and that is going to introduce some latency to this application. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the address that we're sending this email to, and that's admin@company.com, and I'm going to go to the browser, and we're going to search for the emails that have been sent to this SMTP server. So I'm going to paste that email address in here, and you can access the inbox for that user, and you can see the outputs or the emails that have been sent here. It's got that subject critical error in the application, and if you click the email you can see what kind of message has been sent. So it's coming from noreply@company.com, and that of course matches what we passed as the from address. And if we look at the content of the email, we can look at the text for example, and we can see the log output, and the log output here is matching what we had in this formatter with the time, the level and the message. That's what we see here. So the emails are being received by this SMTP host. That's all working, but the problem that we have and what we want to solve here is the latency. 2 seconds nearly to send that email. So imagine that kind of log output occurring in your FastAPI handler function or a Django view. That's going to really slow down the response that's being sent to the client. We need to fix that. One way of fixing it is to use the QueueHandler and the QueueListener. So at this point I'm going to go back to the Python documentation on the logging module, and we're going to look at the QueueHandler. Now this is a class that supports sending your logging messages to a queue, and those queues can be the ones implemented in Python's queue and multi-processing modules. And the QueueHandler class, in concert with the QueueListener class, they let your handlers do the work on a separate thread from the one that's actually doing the logging. And as it says here, it's important in web applications, and that's because when you're returning responses to clients, that needs to happen as quickly as possible. So what you want to do is move any potentially slow operations, such as it says here, sending the email with the SMTP handler, move them to a separate thread. So I'm going to change the code up here. Let's go back to the application. I'm going to change the address that we're sending the email to so that we can see these coming into a new inbox. And if we go down here, I'm going to comment this line of code out. We no longer want to add the SMTPHandler directly. We're going to use the QueueHandler instead. Now I need to import these at the top, so as well as the SMTPHandler, we're going to import the QueueHandler and also the QueueListener. And as it says here in VS Code, the QueueListener class, that implements an internal threaded listener, and that watches for log records being added to a queue, and it removes them from that queue and then passes them to a list of handlers for processing. So by using the QueueListener, we don't need to worry about creating the thread or anything like that, as we're about to see. Now let's bring another import in at the top here. I'm actually going to import the Python queue module. We're going to use that to actually create the queue that we're going to pass to our QueueHandler. So let's scroll down just below the SMTPHandler, and below this line of code that we've commented out, I'm going to paste in a new comment. What we're going to do here is create the queue object and the QueueHandler. So let's start by creating a log queue. We're going to use the queue module and we're going to instantiate a queue object. Once we've done that, we can create the handler here. So let's create a variable here and we're going to instantiate the QueueHandler class, and we pass into that a queue-like object. So we're passing the log queue into that, and that's the instance of this queue object. And the final thing we can do is we can copy this logger.addHandler call, and we're going to pass the QueueHandler into this now instead of directly passing the SMTPHandler. So what we've done here is we've created a QueueHandler and we've passed a queue into that and added that handler to the logger object. Now when we perform these logging operations, these level methods such as critical, it's actually going to send that content to the queue, and what we now need is a QueueListener that's going to pull those log entries off the queue and process them in a separate thread. Now I'm going to go back to the documentation again here, and let's go down to the QueueListener. If we go to the signature of this, you can see that the QueueListener class, when we instantiate that, we send the queue into that, and we also pass any number of handlers into the QueueListener. And these handlers are what's going to handle the log entries that are placed on the queue in the main thread of your application. So let's now go back to VS Code, and underneath the QueueHandler code, I'm going to add another comment. What we're going to do is create a QueueListener and then start that listener by calling its start method. So let's create the variable listener now, and we're going to instantiate the QueueListener, and we're passing the log queue into that. And what we need to pass now is any number of handlers that we want to process the logs that come into the queue. Now we have one handler, and that was the SMTPHandler. So let's copy that and go back down here. We're going to pass that into the QueueListener, and that's the only handler that we need to pass in here. So we can now call the listener.start method, and after we perform the logging, we're going to go to the bottom of this script and I'm going to call listener.stop. So let's now test this out. I'm going to run the application, and this time you can see the duration was 0 seconds. Basically instantaneously, this line of code here printing the duration ran in this script, and that's because this line of code was no longer a blocking operation. We passed this output, this log entry, into the queue, and the QueueListener had this handler set up that pulled the message off the queue and processed it in a separate thread. So this was not a blocking operation, and you can imagine this being very useful if you're performing these logs to an SMTPHandler or any other source over a network. You don't want that blocking your response, so this will greatly speed things up if you need to perform these kind of operations. So the key point is that when we call logger.critical, the email is sent on a listener thread, and that's very useful in a web application, and that could be Django, Flask or FastAPI. It allows you to return the response to the client without being blocked by the processing of the log entry. Now, just to demonstrate this in an application, I want to finish with an example of how we could do this with FastAPI. Now what I'm going to do to start with here is I'm going to rename this file, and it's going to be called logger.py. This is going to contain the setup for the logger in this application, and then what we can do is we can remove all of this code that's performing any kind of log. We're going to move that into a FastAPI application. Now the code for the queue, I'm going to comment that out, and we're going to start by just looking at the SMTPHandler itself. And I'm going to create a new file here called main.py, and that's going to host the FastAPI application. So at the top, let's import FastAPI, and we're going to create an app object here by instantiating that. And in the application, we want to import this logger object that we've created. So at the top, let's import that from the logger module. And I'm also going to import the time module at the top here. So we've created a FastAPI object here. What we're going to do now is we're going to create an endpoint with the app.get decorator. So let's just give this a path of /orders, and we're going to write a function called getOrders that's going to handle a request to this endpoint. Now when the request comes in, I want to create that start variable again by calling time.time. And as an example, I'm just going to paste a logger.critical call in here. And let's give it a sample message of database configuration options not found. Now at this point, if you have a critical log level, you typically want to exit the application because a critical level is associated with a failure in the application where it cannot recover from that failure, it cannot proceed, so you'll probably want to exit the application at that point. We're not going to do that here. We're going to return a response here that contains a single key called duration, and this is going to time the duration of this request, including the call to logger.critical. And to get the duration, we can call time.time, and again we're going to subtract that start time. Once we've written that endpoint, at the bottom I'm going to start the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗁 server, and the file is called main.py, so we're going to look at main, and the name of the app object is app. We separate them with a colon, and I'm also going to pass the -- reload flag in here, and this is going to start the server on localhost 8000. And if we go to the browser and look at this particular endpoint, you can see the response here, the duration. It took 2.27 seconds in order to process the request and return the response. And again, that latency is introduced by the call to logger.critical, and that means whenever a user goes to this endpoint and sends the request, you can see that being processed. It takes quite a bit of time in order to return that response because this is blocked by the latency introduced by sending that email to the SMTP host. So again, let's show how we can offload this work to a QueueHandler. Let's go back to the application, and I'm going to go to logger.py, and I'm going to uncomment these objects that we had here, and I'm going to remove the call to listener.start. So we're going to create the listener by passing the log queue and the SMTPHandler into the listener, but we're not going to start this until the FastAPI application has been started. So let's go back to main.py, and actually before I do that, let's go back here. I need to comment this out because we are no longer adding the SMTPHandler directly, and instead we're adding the QueueHandler. So let's go back to main.py, and at the top from the logger module, as well as the logger, I'm going to import this listener, and right before we create the FastAPI application, what I'm going to do is call listener.start. So we're starting the listener as soon as FastAPI is loaded, and remember we need to call listener.stop as well. So what I'm going to do in order to do that is create a FastAPI lifespan event, and the purpose of that is to stop the listener when the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗁 server that we can see on the terminal here, whenever that's shut down, we want to stop the listener. So we can do that in what's called a lifespan event. I'm going to go to the FastAPI documentation. So I have this page open on lifespan events, and you can define logic that's executed before your application starts up or after it's shut down. And that's what we're going to do now. But if we scroll down, we can see some example code on how to define one of these. We have a decorator called async context manager, and then we define a function that takes the FastAPI object. So I'm going to copy that line of code, and we're going to go back to VS Code here, and right above this listener.start call, I'm going to define the context manager, and we need to import this object, and that's coming from a package in Python called context_lib, so we can import that. And then within the object we can yield, because we don't need to perform any actions when it starts up, and any code that we write after yield, that's code that will be executed when the FastAPI application is shutting down. So at that point, all we need to do is call listener.stop, and that's going to stop the listener, and it's going to ask the thread to terminate. And as it says here, if you don't call the stop function before your application terminates, there may still be some records that are left on the queue and they will not be processed. So it's quite important to call this before the application or the server is terminated. Now, one last thing to do, we've got a function here called lifespan, and that defines this lifespan event. We need to pass that into the FastAPI object when we instantiate that. We can do that with the lifespan keyword argument. So we just pass the reference to the function, and that's going to then perform this action when the application is shutting down. So that code will reorganize the application a little bit. In the logger module, we create the QueueHandler and we add it to the logger. And we also create the listener, which is an instance of QueueListener that takes the queue and the SMTPHandler. And then in this very small FastAPI application, we import that listener and we define a lifespan event that's going to stop the listener when the application is killed. And we pass that event to the FastAPI object via the lifespan parameter. And the effect of all of this code is that the logger.critical call, that's going to send the log to a queue, and then the listener is going to pick up that log message from the queue, and it's going to process that with all of the handlers that are defined on that listener. And in this case, we only have one handler. So let's go back to the browser now, and we're going to test this out. If we we go back to the page for this FastAPI endpoint, when we refresh this page, you can see the latency is very much less now. So instead of taking nearly 2 seconds, this one is taking a minuscule amount of time, basically no latency introduced by the logger call. Now I'm going to go back to logger.py and I'm going to change the email here. Let's change it to admin55 just to test out that this is going to work in the web UI. So I'm going to save this and let's go back to this page and refresh the page. The duration now says 0, so tiny amount of latency. If we go back to this site here and go back to this page, I'm going to check if the email was received after being processed by that QueueHandler. So let's access this and you can see that the emails are coming in. And it's the one at the top that's been sent just now. I think I used the same email address below here for testing this out. But if I go back to the logger.py, let's change this to something I've never used, admin85, and go back here again. If we look at the inbox for that user, we see that we don't have any emails, but if we go back to this page and refresh, and then go back here, when we refresh this, we're going to get this email coming into the inbox, but it's now been sent on the separate thread and it's been sent by that QueueHandler. So that's all for this video. In this video, we've seen how to use an SMTPHandler in order for critical log entries to be sent to administrative users. And that's done with an email. But we also saw that using this SMTPHandler directly can introduce some latency into your application, which is not convenient if you have a web service using something like Django or FastAPI. So an alternative to doing this directly with the SMTPHandler is to create a QueueHandler and offload the work of sending that email to a separate thread using the QueueListener. And we demonstrated the use of this in a very simple FastAPI application where we have a call to logger.critical, and rather than sending the email in the middle of our handler function and taking time to process and causing the client to be delayed in getting the response, instead of that, what we're doing is we're offloading the call to critical to a separate thread, so the processing of the email is done on that thread and we can return a response very quickly to the client. If you've enjoyed this video and learned anything, please consider subscribing to the BetterStack YouTube channel. We're going to have many more of these technical guides, and if you have any suggestions, please let us know in the comments. And if you've not already done so, give the video a thumbs up, and we'll see you in the next video.